Hey, what's up everybody? Rob Marzullo here, Ram Studio Comics. Welcome back. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about how to draw hands, and I want to show you some of the things that you can look for when constructing your hand poses. So like anything else, let's start with a very basic rudimentary pose, about as basic as it gets. And I'll just point out again some of those things to look for when constructing the hands that I think make it much easier to accomplish. So one of the things that's good to do is notice this kind of like diamond point that you get off to one side, and this is actually where the middle finger will be. And this actually, I think, is evident in two spots, and I'll show you that in a second. Another thing that you can pay attention to is the way that the bones kind of collapse or compress inward like this. So a lot of people will draw like a pivot point like this, even though that's a little bit more extreme than the way they converge. But you can really start from there, work your way out, and notice that as well. So this is going to be an open hand pose, and just with the fingers extended outward or upward. But what you want to make sure to really not do when you do the fingers is just draw them as straight lines. This is what beginner artists tend to do, something like that. And what you want to think about is how the fingers themselves can kind of bend and direct independently from one another, even if it's ever just so slightly. It doesn't have to be very extreme, but you want to realize that each one of these kind of take upon their own curvature and their own direction. Once you start to do more and more complex hand poses, you'll see that quite a bit. So let's just have the thumb kind of comes up as a shape here, and this is usually a different shape altogether. Get the back of the knuckle there, and then right here, something like this. So the tricky thing with the thumb is it comes out and then bends away a little bit, and it's got a very independent feel from the rest of the hand. Then the webbing comes across and attaches there. So you've got this larger pad of the thumb right there, the more dominant side, and then you've got this smaller pad over there. So back to this, I really want to show the relationship of the fingers. So the tricky thing I think when constructing the fingers is, first off, getting away from that concept that they're all straight, which they never are. So you got to break that habit, and then also the relationship. So you've got this kind of diamond point here, but then you have this curvature relationship. That's a little low, of the knuckles. So you got this curvature here. And this curvature here, it starts to peak up a little bit more, and just really get used to looking down at your own hand and really checking your work, especially on basic poses, and then get in the habit of taking photos for the more complex poses and studying that. So you've got your own best guide to reference right in front of you, and that's your own hand. So let's start with the middle finger. Let's work up and add these segments, and let's find the peak of the finger here. Now, generally, the middle finger, again, if you were to check your own hand, will be about the same height as the rest of the hand here. So that's usually the first guide that I use for proportions. And then from there, you usually will notice that your index finger, your pointer finger here is going to be smaller. Your ring finger here is going to be smaller, and generally it'll be, this can vary, but it can be a little bit taller than the pointer finger, and then the pinky finger obviously being the smallest of the bunch. So what you do is you start to realize these relationships, and you look for these. So you got the kind of arcing motion here. Notice too that on this set of knuckles, it will actually line up to the tip of the thumb. So all these things can kind of give you these guides and these starting points. The other thing is I see the relationship that you see from the knuckles here becomes evident again back up here. So instead of drawing this as an arc, I like to draw this back as that diamond shape that you see here. To me, that's a little bit more of a better representation than the arcs that you see here. And I think that's a little bit different than what you're going to learn in most books, or that I've learned in other books that I've studied. But a lot of this stuff, you're going to develop your own process. You're going to develop your own perception on the things that you learn. And that's okay. It's very important that you know which things to really adhere to your workflow, and which things you realize are best to kind of let go of because of maybe your own style or your own way of doing things. So there's a really kind of neat thing that happens there when you study and you learn this stuff, and sometimes you do have to develop your own way of perceiving it and doing it. So what I want to also do is make sure not to have the separation in between the fingers all the same. So if you notice there, I have these two kind of closer together. I've got this one spaced out a little more, this one spaced out even more. And that's another thing that I think makes a more interesting hand pose. Now, one of the things that I see that's immediately wrong with what I have here, I need to bring it back out this way to where this end part of the hand is. Now, as far as the width of the hand, it could almost be said that the width of the hand is about the same as the ring finger. Not quite as wide as the middle finger, but it depends on the part you're measuring. It's pretty close, and it's pretty close if you were to bring the middle finger across here to the bone of the thumb right there. So it's really up to what you're seeing, as far as what you're constructing, or if you're studying from reference, then obviously there's lots of different hand shapes. Proportions are going to vary, but let's say right about here for what we're after. And this is a bit rougher because we're getting our construction lines in and we're studying the relationships. So I'm going to soft erase this down now and see if I can draw through this and make a pretty decent hand pose. I'll study my hand and look for inconsistencies in my rough sketch. So I think I want to bring this webbing out further this way. I think I want to increase the size of the thumb a little bit. So we got the knuckle here. Now another thing that I'm going to recommend if you still struggle to get even this far, or really at all, another great thing to study is just drawing the skeletal structure. It gives you a lot better representation of what's going on, because one of the things that happens is you have the webbing and the padding and the skin of the hand up here, but you have to be aware that the knuckles end back here. So that's something I think that's tricky, and a lot of artists may overlook when they're drawing out their work. Now the other thing about the pads of the fingers is they progressively get smaller, but they really have a pretty segmented difference from each area. So what I mean by that is if you were to really study each finger, you'll notice that the pads are not identical as they shape up and converge to the tip of the finger. They're actually quite different from one another in shape and flow or whatever. So it's good to pay attention to things like that, because if not, we tend to just go, well, I'm going to make a finger and I'm going to make every segment identical, and it doesn't look like a finger. It looks like something mechanically constructed or designed. These little bits of variance that you get in there are going to go a long ways to making your anatomy or your drawings look more alive, essentially. So it's knowing when to jump in there and go, you know what, maybe this pad would be just misshapen a little bit, or there'd be a small bump before it connects to the base of the hand here. Little things like that will really liven it up a bit. But in the very beginning, you're just worried about getting everything into place and drawing it halfway decent, and that's okay. Just get that out of the way. But then it's funny how you actually have to reverse think it. Like you start to draw everything as perfect as you can, and then you realize that that's actually hurting the work, that you need some imperfections in there. So a little bit smaller on that pinky. And again, really paying special attention to my fingers, and quite honestly, still some variance. Like this is pretty accurate to the way my hand is shaped, but then as I get to the pinky, it's actually a lot lower than the ring finger there. So I'm going to bring that down even further, just making these small little changes to try to get that right. And I think I've got a little too much angle here. Now, I don't want to necessarily go for an entirely accurate representation here. I am studying my own hand, and I just want you to be aware of that. Like that's always a good thing to do. Obviously, I've mentioned it a couple times here, but for stylized drawings and imaginative drawings, you're gonna take what you see here and you're gonna embellish it, obviously. But I just want to start with the foundational information, and that's also why we start with a very basic pose like this, just get some of this stuff going, warm up with something like this, then take it to the side, and remember, you can also check things from a distance, and you seem to pick out flaws. Like, I'm still not entirely satisfied with the thumb shape here, so I'll keep working on that. I think it needs to be a little bit more of a smooth arc. But again, if I was going for a stylized representation, then I would just throw that out the window and do whatever I thought looks cool. And I think that's a lot of times what I combat with myself going back and forth drawing this, because I'm so used to doing stylized drawings from the mind that then when I study something, I have to compromise a little bit of that for reality, for realism. Okay, so let's use that as our base study, and then now let's work on some more complex, more dynamic shots.